the service of the values and professional perspectives that have characterized the Institute, but also with John Dalton, we share another critical characteristic. 20 years ago, in concluding the Modern American College, I wrote, "Frenzied, unbridled passion, whether in love or work, seldom serves us well. Indeed, it often harms more than helps. To be inflamed, carried away by an affection, ideology, or cause is easy. But such a state shrinks from reflective thought, public scrutiny, and tough-minded testing. Maintaining a steady fire that is critical as well as creative is more difficult, especially when it suffers doses of icy logic and frigid resistance. Cool passion seeks fulfillment by joining the forces of heart and mind, commitment, and critical analysis." Well, that posture has characterized my experiences with John and with these other colleagues with whom I'm privileged to share this institute. And I also know from personal acquaintance with a number of you that it has characterized the persistent efforts of many of you participants who are with us here today. Now I'd like to turn to some substantive comments concerning the first organizing question John asked us to consider for our presentations and for the roundtable discussion this evening. He wrote, "As you reflect on the past 20 years, what do you think have been some of the most important development/factors that have influenced colleges and universities' commitments to the moral and civic development of college students?" As I reflected on this question, and I always try to follow John's instructions, I was reminded of an experience Joe and I had one Halloween when we were living in a townhouse in Centerville, Virginia, in the midst of young families while I was at George Mason University. A young man at dusk in a Batman's outfit with a homemade mask and cape and wings appeared at our door. "Trick or treat." "Wow," I said, "that's a nice outfit." I took a nice red delicious apple from the basket Joe and I set by the door, always wanting to encourage good eating habits in the young, and dropped it into his outstretched bag. He looked down into the bag and then looked up at me and he said, "Thanks, mister, but you just broke all my cookies." Well, one of the things about being the first speaker at a conference that has a general question or theme is that you don't have to worry about other people saying all the things you've prepared, and so you have to be busy scribbling notes and trying to figure out what to say because they've covered all your territory. So hoping not to break my colleagues' cookies, I'd like to remind us of where higher education was during the 60s and 70s and early 80s, prior to the time that John was starting the Institute. And maybe that'll set a context for our conversation this evening and for subsequent discussions. Of course, surprising to some people, I also have lived during the last 20 years. So I can chip in tonight if I have something to add. And before I proceed, I should emphasize that I am not, like Arthur Levine, a scholarly historian of higher education. So what you hear will be based on my own personal experiences and reflections with all the biases that that kind of stuff entails. My first higher education job was at Monmouth College in Long Branch, New Jersey, that was just getting started, when I was hired in 1958 to create a new teacher preparation program. and fired that spring because of major conflicts with then President Schaefer. He became emeritus that October thanks to a suit, partially in thanks to a suit that my colleague Lyle and Eddie undertook with support from the American Association of University Professors, who paid for our lawyer. And you can read about it in the 1959 AUP Journal if you should happen to be interested in that piece of history. Lyle went to the University of Nebraska and I went to Goddard. I was attracted by Goddard's progressive education orientation, and also because by then Joe and I had 4 kids under 5, and after living for 8 years in the New York metropolitan area, we were very interested in raising our kids in Vermont with the kind of environment, cultural and rural and political, that characterizes that state. So I really started to learn about the world of higher education when I went to Goddard that fall of '59 to evaluate a Ford Foundation 6-year experiment in college curriculum development. And that, plus a project on student development that I'll mention a little later, became the basis for education identity. Well, during that time, during the 50s and 60s, higher education was dominated by a meritocratic orientation, educating the best and the brightest, with major help from educational testing services, achievement and aptitude tests, and formulas taking into account GPAs and other high school performance indicators. Selectivity, along with resources and reputation, defined institutional status and prestige. In those years, value added was not part of the vocabulary. Cultivating the intellect was the controlling purpose. It aimed to achieve that purpose through information transfer with almost total reliance on lectures, midterm and final exams, and prescribed textbooks. True, there were a few institutions that use internships and co-op programs, narrative evaluations, other forms of experiential learning, collaborative learning, individualized majors. But they hardly appeared on the still non-existent computer screens of higher education. There was no language about, quote, critical thinking. The affective domain was totally beyond the pale. When I did workshops and professional presentations about the, quote, 7 vectors and the importance of student development, I spent most of the response time dodging slings and arrows of critical comments that I should suggest that such things be part of the purpose of higher education. The single exception was when I was invited to speak at the annual conference of the National Association of Women Deans and Counselors, NADAC. I call my presentation The Young Adult, a New Course for College Personnel Curriculum, and shared my 7 vectors. For the first time, I experienced a warm and interested response, and they published my speech in their journal the following spring. But that kind of response at that time was very rare. In 1970, after Education and Identity got the ACE Book Award, NASPA invited me to speak at their national convention about the implications of education and identity for student personnel services. My major point, as with NADAC, was that graduate programs for student services professionals needed to include courses sharing information about student development, so professionals could address these outcomes more intentionally. The applause was embarrassingly polite, but my spirits were substantially improved afterwards by the copious booze and food and hearty company that at that time, before Gwen's leadership, of course, characterized the organization.